Welcome to Acton Line, a product of the Acton Institute for the Study of Religion and Liberty. I'm Gabriel Jaja, producer. In this episode, Eric Kohn, Acton's Director of Communications, sits down with David Bahnsen to discuss his new book, There's No Free Lunch. In his book, Bahnsen explores how the free market has enabled hundreds of millions of people to rise from the depths of poverty and achieve a higher quality of life. In fact, there's no better economic system for human flourishing. However, a contagion has begun infecting public opinion with regard to capitalism in general and the free markets specifically. Call it socialism, progressivism, or leftism. More and more people each day are turning away from the time-tested free market that has been absolutely essential to the prosperity of nations around the world. The question is, why? You can find additional resources to the show notes of this episode, as well as find previous episodes of Acton Line on our website at acton.org/actonline. If you like this program, you can help us reach even more listeners by sharing it with a friend and leaving us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. We welcome your comments as well. Acton Line is available on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and Spotify.
David L. Bahnsen is the founder, managing partner, and chief investment officer of the Bahnsen Group, a bi-coastal wealth management firm managing over $3 billion in client capital. He is annually recognized as one of the top advisors in the country by Barron's, Forbes, and the Financial Times. He is a frequent economic and political writer for National Review, Forbes, and his very own Dividend Cafe. He is the host of the weekly economic podcast Capital Record and a regular guest on Fox Business, CNBC, and Bloomberg. His most recent book, which we'll be discussing today, is There's No Free Lunch, 250 Economic Truths. David Bahnsen, welcome to Acton Line.
Well, thank you for having me.
So, David, you have a new book out, There's No Free Lunch. Why don't you tell us what is the book about? Why should people pick the book up?
Well, the full name is There's No Free Lunch, 250 Economic Truths. And so what I attempted to do is take 250 different quotes and excerpts from very highly regarded economists and thought leaders. Some are still alive and some have been gone for a few hundred years, but basically take 250 different quotes that I curated and put together and then added my own commentary to each page, each trying to, extract a certain principle or economic truth that I think has great utility in modern times. We organized them by category. So there's sort of a topical compartmentalization, which I think is useful. And the reason I wrote it was I want people who have a free market instinct that are generally intuitively predisposed to markets to have a better foundation for why they believe what they believe, to start to view the case of free markets beyond the efficiencies of market systems, beyond the efficiencies of market allocation of resources, and into the more philosophical and something that will foundationally offer them an intellectual defense that can hold in the debate that I think is surely to come.
What I like about the book and the way that you've laid it out is that it's, I think I heard in John Podhoretz talking about it, that it's like a daily devotional almost, that you can read through these one page or 1 to 2 page chapters, and it's accessible. And I think that for people who look at the topic of economics, who may have that instinct that you're right, if they know something about economics, it's either that they think there's a lot of math to it and they don't understand that, or it's very complicated and, inaccessible to the philosophy of all of it, or it's the dismal science. And those are the things that they know. So how did you go about thinking through making, these ideas and concepts, accessible to that audience?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it was the challenge of the book was how to go about organizing it in a way that would flow the way I wanted and would stay digestible for those readers. And then, of course, the commentary that I added on each quote, it was incumbent upon me to have a certain clarity and succinctness that would be understandable, not require a PhD. There's no charts in the book. There's no graphs, and that was all intentional. Part of it is not just pragmatic. Part of it is I really wanted to communicate the message that economics is not econometric. economics is not fundamentally a mathematical science. It is anthropological at its roots. So defining economics in a sort of social context that centers around the human person, we get at that right at the beginning of the book, and I think it sets the tone for the rest of the book, so that when you start going through things like tax policy and minimum wage laws and other sort of practical policy applications, it's all rooted in the foundations about the human person, and that was all done by design.
Were you at all, in your motivations for this book, influenced by what I think I sense in the culture? Somebody who got very much into economics, years ago, and found people like Milton Friedman and Friedrich Hayek, and within the political order that existed, on the right, Jonah Goldberg, I've heard him made this point numerous times that the favorite economists of libertarians are the favorite economists of conservatives as well. And there seems to be something changing. And I think it's also undergirded by a bit of the mystery, and maybe we can, we'll get into it a little bit later too, what we're seeing right now in the political and economic environment out there. The sense that the old rules don't apply, right? We've been saying for so many years, if we spend so much money, we're going to get inflation, and we didn't get inflation, and now all of a sudden we are seeing it. But there was, I think, definitely in that period, this mentality that said, well, maybe all of those old dead economists were wrong and the rules don't apply anymore.
Well, I think there's two different things you're bringing up there. So let me start with the first, because I do think that whole old rule inflation stuff invites a whole kind of separate conversation, but it's one I actually really want to have. Look, I'll just shoot very straight. The reason why I wrote the book is very much about what you're describing. My belief that a lot of people who would identify as being on the right, who identify as being conservative, who identify as being opposed to more interventionist economics and more involvement from the government in the past, I think that they're susceptible right now to tremendous economic error, because it appears to me that their beliefs were not as rooted in economic principles that I think transcend the various, challenges of time as we might have hoped. And I have been frustrated for a long time. I've talked about this immensely with many of my friends at the Acton Institute, for that matter. The great economic influences that most of us would have that defend free markets, defend classical economics, defend the notion of human action as a center of economic living, are mostly unbelievers and libertarian-minded in a lot of their political orientation. So Friedrich Hayek, Milton Friedman, Ludwig von Mises are quoted immensely throughout the book. They're all mentors of mine economically. But I think that what you see right now with a lot of the movement and inkling on the right to be tempted away from what they call market orthodoxy and into something that invites the partnership with the state as a means of implementing desired social ends, I think it comes from a misunderstanding of what market economics really is, and perhaps an impatience with what I believe is the Burkean model for civil society. And I don't think we have to abandon market orthodoxy to get there. And so, look, if Bernie Sanders reads the book and says, I changed my mind, I'm no longer a socialist, I'll be very happy. But I don't think that's going to happen. I do want an argument against progressivism, against socialism, against Keynesianism, against a lot of these things that are considered to be left-wing oriented economics to be out there. I suspect the book is better for people that have a market orientation to equip them better to defend against those things than it is to persuade those people. But if it were just left-wing economic fallacy I was concerned with, I would have been less motivated. It was exactly what you described, that I think there are folks on the right now that are doubting what they've always believed, or perhaps never really fully believed it. I'm willing to, but it isn't so much I want to go into specific names, because I also am not convinced that all these people are coming from it in the exact same way. But there is a certain kind of right-wing populism, and some of it is more pop culture, Fox News-ish, that is more expressing a kind of frustration against some status quo stuff. And then
some of it's very people looking, some of these arguments seem like the nearest weapon to hand in order to go after certain people that they want to go after.
I think that's right. And it's always rhetorically pretty effective, even if it's not abundantly thoughtful. And so there is that kind of Tucker Carlson thing going on, some of which I really like what he has to say, some of which I think is unhelpful. But then there is a more earnest and more intellectual, but equally, I think, misguided opposition to market orthodoxy right now, coming from reasonably thoughtful people, but folks that I think right now are very frustrated with other things. And I think they've pointed their guns in the wrong direction.
Well, so the term that you just used there, market orthodoxy, I think the often pejoratively used term that you get from that crowd is market fundamentalism. I think, how would you differentiate those two terms? And do you think that is there any kind of a market fundamentalism out there? I have my own opinions on that, but I'm curious what you think.
Well, I think when people use the term, they mean it to say there are people who believe markets cure everything and that markets can bring about the perfect society. One of the reasons I believe in free markets is not that I believe it is my desired way to get to utopia, but it's because I do not believe in utopia. And so it is an anti-utopian view to begin with. It accepts a constrained vision of society that on this side of glory, we will not reach these utopian ends. So now what we're talking about is what system both optimizes human individuality, responsibility, accountability, and opportunity. And to the extent that I believe our aim is human flourishing, I find markets to be a better vehicle for these other aims to find their footing. However, market fundamentalism, used pejoratively, is primarily a straw man because I think from Aristotle all the way through into the moderns, nobody has ever argued that free exchange and the elimination of disinterested third parties from the way producers and consumers interact brings forth inherently a more moral good in society. What we have argued, rather, is that a more moral good in society leads to better free exchange and a better and more optimal economic outcome. So the Burkean vision that couples what I guess today would be called free market orthodoxy with mediating institutions and heavy emphasis and priority on religion, on ethics, and on character discipline. To me, these things represent a blended solution that ought to be scratching all these itches. But to just turn to this sort of straw man of pure market fundamentalism that is divorced from cultural, moral sensibilities, I think is unfortunate. It's most certainly not what I'm advocating.
I remember a good friend of mine who until recently was at the Foundation for Economic Education. I remember him giving a presentation to a group that I worked with years ago with this piece for like 10 errors that people advocating free markets make. And I remember one of them being, never say the market will take care of it, because people are that's not going to comfort anybody who wasn't already going to have that answer at the ready for themselves. And that's it seems to me what you're saying is that, and I think this is the right orientation to it, is that markets are a necessary condition for human flourishing, but they are not a sufficient condition for it, and that making them ends in and of themselves. I can understand the critique on that level, but yes, as certainly us here at the Acton Institute would make the argument that there's more that needs to exist there, an understanding in anthropology, an understanding of virtue in market interactions that's necessary for that sense of human flourishing.
Ironically, though, I would say the same thing that you have just said about markets. I would say it about freedom. I would say it about democracy or various forms of representative government. All of these things are necessary but in insufficient conditions for optimal living in a free society. And so they're no more a critique. The fact that they are insufficient is no more a critique of their necessity for markets than it is for these other categories. Sexual fidelity in marriage is a necessary condition for a healthy marriage. It is not a sufficient one. There are plenty of people who are faithful in their marriages who are miserably married and unloving to one another and so forth. So the question becomes, what is the view of markets that we thrive for? And I do believe that the necessity of markets is holding in line that optimal allocation of resources that I think is necessary to drive the right incentive structure in society, and also to create the risk-reward paradigm that I think has been most fruitful for wealth creation. But the things that people are critiquing, that does vary, I suppose, in the details. On the left, it's primarily become about income and wealth inequality. On the right, I think it has more to do, I would divide it in two categories. One, I spent a lot of time in the book on, it's one I'm very sympathetic to, is they're very upset about crony capitalism. I am upset about corrupted government, but I'm not an anarchist. I'm upset about crony capitalism, but I'm not a socialist. My antidote to crony capitalism is to eliminate the crony part of it. And of course, the way you eliminate the crony part of it, what is crony capitalism? It is the wedding together, partnering together of business interest with the powerful hand of the state to put a finger on the scale. Well, one of the greatest things you can do to reduce cronyism is reduce the ability of the state to have their finger on the scale, to reduce the overall size of government, the regulatory apparatus of government that gives crony opportunity and incentive to begin with. So the idea of treating the problem of cronyism with more government invites more cronyism. And so the various concerns right now on the right about market fundamentalism, market orthodoxy, I think they can be resolved by us getting back to the first principles, and many of those are the subject of the book.
Yeah, I remember years ago being invited to participate in a debate in Chicago with someone from the Occupy Wall Street movement. And the subject of the debate the question was, who's to blame for the Great Recession, big government or big business? And I had the great fortune of going first and being able to get up there and say, the answer is yes, and sitting back down. And I thought at the time that, you've Occupy Wall Street, I thought, well, shouldn't it be Occupy K Street? Because, you can have those, you can find it in Adam Smith, right? That, you can't get two people of the same trade together before the conversation eventually turns to a conspiracy against the public good. His point wasn't that, there's a way to make that not happen, is to say that you have to understand that that is what the inclination is. And a market system where you can have competition and not without a government ensconcing them in locking them in to that conspiracy, you're going to have a way to break that, at least address that problem.
Well, that's exactly right. Now, in that particular case, the financial crisis, it's funny because that was the very subject of my first book, Crisis of Responsibility, where if I could have been invited to a debate on that topic, I would have had to take the all of the above and then some position, because Main Street appears to me to have been uninvited to the list of candidates and perpetrators. And I would have argued that question, that dilemma, which I would argue is a false dilemma in the very thesis of the debate, did highlight the reason why I needed to write that book. There was largely a correct and understandable movement on the right that wanted to make sure government got the blame for the crisis because the government had tons of blame for the crisis. And there was a huge movement on the left, the Occupy Wall Street group, but also more the conventional view was that Wall Street deserved a lot of that credit, or that blame rather. And my view was that Wall Street had plenty to blame and government had plenty to blame. And there was a kind of sub-camp of folks blaming the Fed, but that the idea that Main Street was the victim and not a co-perpetrator was absurd and was morally reckless to give them a pass. And so that was sort of the contention of my book. And I don't think that we'll win that debate in history in terms of how it gets memorialized, but I do think that we're on the right side of the argument.
I'm curious then what you think that as you addressed it in that book, the inability, because I think you would agree, though, that the consensus view of what caused that crisis does remove a lot of the blame from Main Street and focuses on a competition for blame between those two. How much do you think that has influenced the way that we talk and think about business matters, financial matters, economic matters today in a political setting?
It's the biggest factor. And I would not only argue that Main Street got removed, but the fact of the matter was Main Street was placed as the victim. So they not only were removed from the suspect lineup, they were actually put in a whole different box as the victim of the crisis. And what I refer to here as Main Street is that home borrower who might have recklessly levered up in a way they couldn't afford, might have fraudulently done so, most commonly, and what was the biggest source of capital destruction, just simply gave back a home they could still afford to pay for, but because they had gone upside down, decided to return it to the bank. And I write about all this in great detail in the book. But the reason I think that post-financial crisis, that is essentially what has happened that has created a lot of this populist uprising. We've had sub-trend line growth for 13 straight years. That always creates a great deal of economic anxiety that's both global and domestic. And then I think that on the left, a lot of young people, folks that are right now 30, were teenagers, maybe graduating high school at the time of the financial crisis. Their experience in young adulthood has been coming out of the crisis, presumably seeing mom and dad struggle with their houses, going into college that did not go down in price when everything else was down in price, getting expensive college education they're still paying for and did not necessarily get a job that the wages were commensurate with the amount of debt, and the student loan issues and then now perhaps they've overcome that. They've worked really hard, got a good job, and they can't afford to buy a home, even with a pretty good young career as, let's say, a 28-year-old or 32-year-old or something. That's a pretty challenging set of circumstances to enter young adult life with and to have it inform and shape your view of markets. So I think it's created a lot of resentment and pushed people into a more resentment-oriented economics, which tends to be more progressive. But I think the exact same thing happened out of the Great Depression. The New Deal was born out of the Depression-era resentments, the Great Society out of a lot of the social unrest of the 1960s. And I think post-financial crisis will end up being the period at which market advocates failed to make the case in the public square.
How much do you think it is also a confusion of people who are market advocates, sometimes by their own mistakes, or sometimes get dragged into defending business, which is not the same as defending a market system, and that we create somewhat of a confusion between the two, that we think, especially to interlocutors, that they think that we're defending whatever business, be it big business or small business, wants to do is what we're actually defending, as opposed to a market economy.
See, I am torn on this subject because I very much agree with the sentiment that you're getting to. It's just that I actually believe most of the time that people will say you're defending the special interest of big business. There's nothing market-oriented about this. That generally those people are doing a sleight of hand. That their interest is not just anti-big business. Their interest is anti-markets. And so you can walk into a trap where by going along and pointing out how your sympathies are not with big tech or Wall Street or whatnot, you play into the rhetorical game of class envy, and yet in reality, their ideological sympathies are not yours. And so I think that you're certainly right. We have a responsibility to have great clarity in defending, when we defend business, making clear that we're defending the concept of enterprise. We're defending the concept of aspiration. But I think to pile on Wall Street as a means of pointing out, the kind of anti-big business alignment we want does risk us looking that we're anti-capital markets, and I think that's very dangerous. And I think that many on the left are setting a trap for us when we go about that. So what is the solution in the messaging? It really is just truthfulness. We are pro-markets. We want thriving businesses. It just so happens, as a believer in Hayek's knowledge problem, the same argument I would make against Washington, D.C. having the knowledge necessary to command control the society is an argument generally against the efficiency of big business. I really like small business as a means of optimizing return on investment, as a means of optimizing capital allocation. But I want to avoid both traps. I never want to defend big business as if it were synonymous with markets and appear cronyist. I recognize those distinctions, and certainly Adam Smith was no fan of big business in that sense. But I also want to avoid piling on big business in a way that makes it appear as if I have common ground with those who I do not.
You mentioned the financial sector and Wall Street, and I guess the question I want to ask you is, how much of a problem in some of these conversations is it that the common understanding of what happens in the financial sector and what happens on Wall Street seems to me often to be the kind of caricature that you see in Hollywood films, and that for, I know people who, invest in individual stocks themselves. You get a lot of that, TD Ameritrade trading now. But at most, it seems that there's a limited understanding to me of what Wall Street actually does, what financial markets actually do. And I'll admit a challenge myself is that I don't understand it well enough to be able to explain that to people. And it seems that it's one of the areas that of all the topics I think have touched on, a whole heck, maybe with the exception of mentioned big tech, certainly a place for a lot of scorn being heaped on it right now. But that Wall Street idea, a lot of scorn gets heaped on it.
Well, I hope that if God gives me enough decades to keep chipping away at this objective, that somehow my life and career can be used to move the needle positively on the subject, because you're exactly right, and it's an insurmountable task, it feels like right now, but the need is for better education around what we mean and don't mean. And the notion of conservative-minded people, classical liberals, defenders of a free society, to take an anti-Wall Street view is completely counterintuitive to me. But it is sensible if they understand Wall Street to be a caricature, to be Gordon Gekko from the famous 1987 movie, which I have seen over 100 times. The fact of the matter is that Wall Street is a metaphor. And Wall Street is not a physical place. If one actually went to the literal Wall Street in New York City, it's in Lower Manhattan. It's basically a museum. The New York Stock Exchange is still there at the corner of Wall and Broad, but it doesn't trade securities. It's really a museum, a media center. The fact of the matter is that Wall Street is a symbol for capital markets, and capital markets are the structures of capital formation that lead to businesses operating, various debt and equity and hybrid structures that can come out of banks, can come out of investment firms, come out of venture capital, come out of private equity, private credit. There's been an incredible amount of innovation in capital markets, and that innovation has been job producing, job creating. It has been profit inducing. Overwhelming amount of positives have come out of it. Have there been greedy actors in the business of capital? Oh, I would say so. Sin has not been immunized out of Wall Street. But of course, that same thing is true of any other sector, any other industry on this side of glory. So it isn't an argument against capital markets per se. It is an argument for more men and women of faith entering financial markets. But the defense of capital markets is essentially a defense of free enterprise. You cannot have capitalism without capital markets, and those innovations around the capital structures of a business and the freedom of capital structures is incredibly important. Do you lose a lot of an audience here? Maybe you do. Is there any temptation out there right now, any rush to defend the well-paid people that wear suits and ties in financial markets? No, there is not. But most of that, to me, comes from a covetousness. It comes from a class envy. And it also comes from a lack of specificity. And this I talk about in another chapter of my aforementioned book. It's funny, we're talking about my new book, but I keep referencing the old one. But in Crisis of Responsibility, I talk about people's criticism of big media, big government, big Wall Street, big business. There are just individual actors in all those spaces that are incredibly unlikable and worthy of our scorn and derision. But generally, I think most of the time we throw out very high-level, non-specific categorizations like that is because we don't have to be specific. It gives us a kind of ability to not actually have to make a cogent argument. Oh, you're just here defending Wall Street. That's a substitute for real argument because all it means is now I don't have to say what I really mean. Everyone knows Wall Street's bad, big business and so forth. I do not think I'm going to generate an army of sympathizers if I make my moral crusade defending the stock and bond capital allocators of Wall Street. My crusade is for human action. My crusade is for the human flourishing that can come from a free society, and I am thoroughly convinced that we want greater men and women of virtue handling capital allocation, what we call Wall Street. And if we believe that we will more faithfully execute our mission at hand with those folks on our side, it seems to me incumbent upon us to make that case. So I'm going to keep doing it.
In the list there, and I imagine if you writing this, you're right, we are talking more about your previous book, but an interesting conversation nonetheless, so I think we'll keep going. At the time, in that list of bigs that you gave, probably wouldn't have put big tech into that because you see the growth of, at least of what I think we're talking about now when people say big tech has come on, I think, largely since that financial crisis. I'm curious because we've had a number of episodes on questions around big tech on Acton Line recently. We had Michael Miller from Acton talk to Robbie Suave about his new book, and I talked to Michael about his new book. Michael is a skeptic of big tech. I'm just curious, in general, your thoughts on big tech, because I think it flows into that conversation that we were talking about earlier, especially on the political right, that I think in some ways it gets folded into, you're defending a market economy sense, and it allowed these big tech firms to grow up, and you're seeing the way that they're operating almost without, you don't have recourse to them, that the public square is now dominated by Facebook, and if you get banned from Facebook, you don't have access to it anymore. And this, I think, if I'm attempting to steelman the arguments of some of those people, that this is a market failure, that it's created this big business that it can deny you access to the public square.
Well, first of all, the conversation can't end there. They then have to say, so what next? And if their solution is Mark Zuckerberg is a failure, therefore I propose Elizabeth Warren replace him, color me unconvinced. However, I am mystified why people are not open to the idea that the experience of history time and time and time again of these companies that get in over their skis, exceed the tolerance society will have for their power and reach, and the natural spontaneous order of innovation, of competition. I don't believe for a second that Facebook cannot be moved from their particular pedestal. Just from a purely sociological, observational standpoint, it does appear to me that most users are Gen Xers like myself, and that younger generations are not at all enthralled by Facebook. So if nothing else, there might be a demographic case against their continued authority. I think
Robbie made this argument in his conversation with Michael that if we're talking about Facebook specifically, that his opinion is we're watching it crumble right before our eyes right now.
I think he's right. But it's funny you say if we're talking about Facebook specifically, well, we have to, because we talk about big tech, we don't know what we're talking about. This is the argument I'm making. The criticisms I have of Facebook are different than ones I have of Amazon, which are different than ones I have of Google, which are different than ones I have of Twitter. And in each case, I desire specificity about what the concern is. The big tech is not a problem for me in the sense that I am not theoretically opposed to companies being big. I am very opposed, and by the way, I think it is an incredibly slippery slope to go against Bork's argument for the anti-competitive nature of monopolies and to buy into a more left-wing view that monopolies become monopolistic purely around size. I think that there must be something damaging to the consumer for us to start using terms in a legal construct like monopolistic. But I think that there are legitimate concerns that are substantial culturally, morally, legally, and economically with all the aforementioned companies, but they are for different reasons. It is politically most beneficial and emotionally most satisfying to lump them all in together. But here's the thing. The left is mad at Facebook because they make too much money, don't pay enough taxes, and they let those little bot ads against Hillary Clinton stay up. That is not the same thing as what the right is upset about: censorship, free speech, things like that. When we buy into the argument of big tech is bad, we are lumping ourselves in together with people that don't share the same concerns that we have. And so I think clarity here is very important. I do actually believe of those various companies that Google is by far the most problematic of the bunch. But again, and there is the least prevalent, accessible market solution to Google's issue than I think there is with some of the others. I'm incredibly open to the idea of discussing how Amazon Web Services and Amazon e-commerce does potentially represent monopolistic concerns. I don't want to rush into it. I'm a conservative, not a revolutionary. I think you have to be slow, prudent, but there is some prima facie argumentation there that's compelling, and that web services business is far more problematic. If you talk to most people mad at Amazon, they usually don't have much to say about the delivery of their packages. They like what they get, and they like when they get it. And yet the web services side represents a more egregious reach into their ability to control other parts of technological infrastructure. Facebook and Twitter, then you're getting into censorship, and people throw out Section 230, and we talk about free speech. I remain of the opinion that Acton is under no obligation to have speakers they disagree with come sit at their conferences, and yet I'm also understanding that Facebook and Twitter are different. They're not the content provider, and so when they're going to pretend to just simply be a venue that allows people to exchange, certain common standards need to be applied. So I'm not a friend of big tech in this context. All I am is a friend of clarity of thought, and that when we have very legitimate concerns to bring up that require, in some cases, policy solutions, in some cases, maybe it won't be policy-driven, or will be market-driven, culture-driven, what have you. But I think it is appropriate to demand clarity and specificity, and I don't think we're getting a lot of that right now.
Where do you think what do you think the cause of some of this, what I think would be the unconservative behavior from some people who are on the right to want to rush into what are essentially political solutions that I think they are, in a sense, rushing into? I'm reminded of the Mencken quote that, for every problem, there's an answer that is clear, simple, and wrong. I think kind of in a list that you gave earlier where we separated out things like, there's markets, there's culture, there are values and ethics. And I think we tend to look for, especially now, silver bullets that are going to solve all the problems for us. But I think that's one of the things that surprised me the most about the reaction to, I think, a lot of the things we've been talking about, is the willingness of some people now to want to rush into, the state can solve this problem.
I have found, and I don't know what the cause and effect here is, but I have found sometimes that some of the most zealous libertarians can very quickly become the most zealous authoritarians. And I think that there may very well be something intrinsic there. I don't know. But what I do know is you're right, that is what we're seeing. There was an announcement a few weeks back about China implementing really strict rules about how much kids could use their iPhone during a school week. And I was blown away by how many on the right said, like, oh, I think that sounds like a great thing. And I would say, do you mean kids having less use of the electronic device throughout the school week or something? Or do you mean the state saying so? The state becoming the messianic, paternalistic role of mother and father and dictating those policies? because it struck me as surreal that we would actually look favorably upon the government as being the arbiter of kids' use technology. And of course, I say that as someone who's really concerned about kids' excessive use of technology. I just find the notion of the Communist Chinese Party being the arbiter of that to be really much more problematic. And so that does get to the heart of the matter here. Are we just concerned with solution? Are we concerned with problems, or are we concerned with solutions? If we want to be concerned with solutions, it's incumbent upon us to not recommend solutions that are themselves potentially worse than the problem. And where do I think it comes from? I think it's spiritual. I do. I think it's impatience. I think we have problems that did not come overnight. They took a long time to marinate into the social fabric of society. And I think that we are flustered that we're not seeing immediate resolution. But I am actually encouraged because I continue to believe the playbook is there, and we're frustrated that we're not getting solutions out of plays that we haven't run. And so the long run of stronger families, of subsidiarity, of mediating institutions, a stronger culture, of better schools, there's a whole lot of things that can get there. Now, is that going to get President Trump back on Twitter tomorrow or something like that? No. But I don't want to belittle some of those things that have happened. They are concerning, but I simply think we must vigorously oppose turning to a solution that comes from a problem we're frustrated with, that solution itself is not fully vetted.
Yeah, what you said earlier about that you reject the idea of utopia, I think so much of our conversation is dominated by, I think, both sides now believing that there is some kind of utopia that not only can we achieve, but we can achieve very quickly. And for me, my personal orientation has grown to, I want to make things, we're fallen creatures. And this, we're never going to have nirvana on this plane of existence. So I want to just make things slightly less bad over time and try to improve them. And I think that there's just this impatience that seems to exist out there right now, especially with, we were talking earlier about how fast time seems to move. That we talked on this podcast back in February, and it seems like it was much longer ago. And time absolutely seems to move so quickly. I think leading to a lot of that impatience, like time's moving so fast, why aren't we doing anything?
Yeah, no, I agree completely. And there's sort of an eschatological component to this. I really do believe God is advancing the purposes of his kingdom, and I have particular eschatological convictions that tie into that, but those are just merely what I believe will end up happening. What we think ought to happen is a different subject, and what ought to happen is obedience and faithfulness, but sometimes it does require patience. And particularly in the civil sphere, I think that for those of us who reject statism, reject a messianic view of American government, it is really important for us to remember that getting elections won doesn't solve the problems as much as we think it does. Now, you want to win elections. You want candidates that are in line with your principles and all those kinds of things. But I think we've seen time and time again, if you're winning the electoral war and losing the culture war, it's only a matter of time until you're going to lose the electoral war as well. And I think that when it comes to big tech, our view of finance, the relationship between the citizen and the state, we have, I think it was George Will who said this, but he may have stolen it from Margaret Thatcher. I can never remember. But the notion that first you win the argument, then you win the election, I think we just have to be focused right now on winning the arguments, demonstrating faithfully, exhibiting faithfully the right worldview in the public square. Those things will play out.
I want to ask you about inflation, but before we go there, since you brought it up, how much do you think the problems that seem to be around us right now stem in some way from that eschatological problem that we have a lot of people, especially as you see the decline of religion in public life and religiosity in particularly the American people, but around the world too, that because we're not thinking in those terms, because we're not thinking beyond our own existence, that you fall back into, almost to borrow from Keynes, who we referenced earlier, in the long run, we're all dead. So what does it all matter? And because, I would want to think that as a big fan of Yuval Levin's work, the way that we have allowed institutions to be hollowed out and use them for our own personal benefit, as Yuval would say, to stand on as platforms to advance ourselves, we'd be far less inclined to do that, I think, if we thought more about eschatology and a theory of the end times and what comes beyond this plane of existence. If we were thinking about that, we think we'd be a little bit more willing to curate what we have here right now in a better way.
Yeah, the way I've said it, I agree with you 100%. And the way I've said it is that Christians often fail to think the right way about the future, and non-Christians often fail to think the right way about the past. And so I think we'd be in a much better position if unbelievers had a better understanding of the human person, of the realities of creation. And believers would be in a better position if they had forward-looking vision, understanding. The end times discussions, there will always be disagreement, but I think that an apathy about eschatology is incredibly dangerous and has practical implications. For a long time, it seemed as if apathy about eschatology was irrelevant because most people were operating with an eschatology, even if they weren't thinking with one. And what I've seen is that doesn't last. It's not sustainable. So I definitely believe that Christians would be better organized, thoughtful, and prepared if there was more conscious theological focus on eschatology.
Since I have you here, I do have to ask you about the inflation. We talked about this on our Acton Unwind podcast on Monday with the number. It was 6.2%, I believe, which was a shock to a lot of people. Now, I follow your work and the products that you put out from the Bahnsen group, and I listened to, I believe, on the commentary podcast talking about inflation a while ago, making the case for what people have been saying, transitory inflation. Do you think it's, well, am I characterizing you correctly? Because I could be incorrect. But also, I guess I could just generally ask the question, what is going on?
Well, let me back up a bit. We had a 6.2% move higher in the CPI year over year. If you go back 2 years, the annualized rate is 3.7. So that base effect explanation, taking the very low price level of mid-2020 when the whole economy was shut down and comparing that to year-over-year prices, that was highly disingenuous. Some people were doing it with good intentions but ignorantly, and some people were doing it very dishonestly. But a 2-year average of price level of 3.7% is still very high relative to where we've been. X food and energy, it's 2.6%. I don't like doing the X food and energy thing because I think most people eat and I think most people drive. So food and energy ought to be part of how they're measuring the price level. But the fact of the matter is that when you look at it being between 2.5% and 3.5% year over year over the last couple of years, it looks a little bit more benign relative to how much of those price movements were related to just simply recovering from low price levels. But we have above trend price level right now. So the question is, what is my point when I talk about disinflationary pressures in the economy? My point is that most people are arguing for the right thing in the wrong way. I believe we have prices going higher right now, and I'm perfectly fine to call that inflation if it looks like a duck, quacks like a duck. But I believe Milton Friedman was right that inflation is too much money chasing too few goods. I do think it's helpful to add to his sentence, too few goods and services in the realities of the present economy. And right now, it is abundant to me that from a quantity theory of money standpoint, the money supply times velocity is not where we're getting inflation. Money times velocity equals the price level times total goods and services, the supply side. The supply side is where the problem is. We have too few goods and services relative to economic need. That is not just relative to money in circulation, but it is relative to demand. The demand is so much higher than the supply of goods and services. Some things are clearly transitory. We already saw lumber prices drop significantly because there was an inability to get the timber and get lumber to end user, and that got rectified, and lumber prices dropped 70%. But right now, the ports, the truck drivers, the labor shortages, all of the semiconductor issues, which has a lot to do with global manufacturing. Some of these things might be fixed in 3 weeks and some might not be fixed in 4 months. And so I think the transitory debate is really unhelpful because people can disagree on what the meaning of the word transitory is. I am not of the opinion that inflation is not a problem. I am of the opinion that the government spending is not the cause of the inflation. If we concede that government spending creates inflation inherently, then we'll have given them the tool they need because they want that. They want to believe all they have to do is spend more money and they can inflate away the debt they've created. The disinflationary reality I worry about, the economic stagnation I worry about, what I have termed Japanification of the American economy that I worry about comes not because I'm sanguine or optimistic about government spending. It's because I'm so pessimistic about it. It's that I believe it creates a diminishing return in the economy, that over time, the marginal revenue product of government spending declines, and this puts downward pressure, downward movement on growth rates. We're talking about 1.6% real GDP growth since financial crisis. That's half of post-World War II trendline real GDP. It's totally unacceptable. We had a debt to GDP that was 16%. It's now going to be above 25%. That's what's going on in the economy longer term, the more secular and structural issue I'm worried about. So right now, price is going higher. It's hurting lower income people. It is real. It is certainly a great political opportunity for Republicans to hammer the Biden administration and so forth. They're going to do it no matter what I say. But as far as me talking to people of good faith about economic reality, I would simply say that our challenge with price level right now is because we do not have enough goods and services being produced. So how do you get that? You need more labor dynamism. You need more incentives to productivity. You most certainly have to deal with the logistical hassles about ports and truck drivers and those things. But fundamentally, is QE the cause of this? Like if they eliminated QE tomorrow, instead of tapering it down over 9 months, if they just stopped bond purchases tomorrow, which I very much wish they would do, if they did, is that going to get any new truck drivers in the workforce? Not one. It is completely irrelevant to what is actually causing the price inflation we have now. It does other problems. It misallocates capital. It skews risk and reward. It contributes to the financialization of the economy. I'm not a defender of it. I'm simply saying when we wrongly identify cause and effect, it comes back to bite us later. So that's my agenda in this inflation debate, is trying to be a truth teller and recognize that government spending creates stagnation. It doesn't create an overheated economy. I don't even know what that is. Too many people are doing too well. They're working too much. That it just is not reality. We have people leaving the workforce. That's a cultural problem. It is a supply side problem. That's my dog in this hunt.
I guess the specter that all hangs over that as well is the effects of policy that was created to deal with the coronavirus pandemic as well. Because when you amended Milton Friedman's line to add services onto the end of it, the first thing that I think of is, well, there are still places in this country where the access to services is artificially constricted because there are businesses that can't operate at full capacity like they were before. Or even I'm going to New York on Sunday, and I've got the email from the event that I'm going to with I have to present a government ID and proof of vaccination to get into the dinner that I'm going to. I know that that's with, a lot of places in New York right now. So there's artificial restriction on that supply of services. Not to mention what we've all also been talking about, the disruptions in the supply chain that have been a child of what happened in this pandemic that are also contributing, I imagine, to that lack of goods and services that are out there being chased by those dollars.
I agree completely. And so my view is that the demand level and the supply level of services is still not back to pre-COVID levels. but the demand level is higher than the supply level, so there's a delta to cover. On the good side, the demand is way higher than pre-COVID, and the supply is higher than pre-COVID, but dramatically lower than the demand side. So in both cases, you have a delta between demand and supply. They're not in equilibrium. It's pushing prices higher. And the solution has got to be greater productivity and eliminating those impediments to greater supply and productivity. So things like the policy side of reopening, revitalization, all of that is very, very important. Look, you're not going to get a marginal tax cut right now. There's no Art Laffer supply side going into the White House anytime soon. But one of the great things they were going to do was going to exacerbate the problem, and that was raising marginal tax rates on business income, on investment income, and on personal income. And it appears that all three of those things are now off the table. That's helpful. But the greatest inhibitor right now to supply side is not tax policy. It is the regulatory aspect. And unfortunately, those are human errors that need to be rectified.
One final question on your book, David. So you have 250 of these economic truths that are in the book. And as you were collating these, I'll ask the question two ways. Either what is your favorite of them, or if you only had enough time in an elevator ride to share one of them with someone that you think would have the greatest impact on just the average person if they were to learn it, what would it be?
Well, I don't just say this because I'm on an Acton podcast sitting in Acton's offices, but this is truly how I feel. The book is chock full of different quotes from Father Sirico, from Sam Gregg, from Victor Carr. There are a number of Acton scholars who are represented. And though I am an incredibly big fan of Friedrich Hayek, I would go to an Acton truism that gets to the dignity of mankind if I had an elevator ride and was making kind of one particular case. Something around one of the various quotes that really gets to the heart of economics is the study of human action towards the aim of human flourishing. And the reason I would is because I think it's foundational to all the other things I want to say and talk about, but also because I think it is what animates humans the most. I think it actually excites people. If I make the case, hey, here's this great economic truth that really optimizes, labor conditions around removing government dictates on wage laws. I think it would be true. I think I would be cogent in the presentation, but I don't think it excites people the way that rethinking economics around the dignity of the human person does. That is the key principle by which I want everything else to be discussed. So certainly Father Sirico's quote in the book about understanding alleviation of poverty, that we build wealth when we produce more than we consume, and that we need to teach the unfortunate how to be better producers, not how to be better consumers of what others produce. There is an economic logic in it, but more than that, there's an anthropological beauty in it. And that is where I would go if I was in a very long elevator ride with somebody.
David L. Bahnsen is the founder, managing partner, and chief investment officer of the Bahnsen Group, a bicoastal wealth management firm with over $3 billion in client capital. His most recent book that we've been discussing today is There's No Free Lunch, 250 Economic Truths. David, thank you so much for joining us today on Acton Line.
Thank you so much for having me.
As always, thank you for listening. Our team loves putting this podcast together for you. It's encouraging to hear from our listeners. Feedback is incredibly important to us because it lets us know what you'd like to hear more of, including the kinds of topics you're interested in most. If you have comments, feedback, or ideas for a show topic or interesting guest, you can email our team at producer@acton.org. Until next week, for Acton Line, I'm Gabriel Jaja.